Welcome back to Up and Adam. I'm Jack Tomzak. That is Andrew Lee.
Good morning.
Be sure to go to centralmediaservices.com/up-and-adam to see the live video feed of today's show. See how handsome Andrew is today. Looks very handsome.
Oh, thanks, Jack. So do you.
Very, very handsome.
He's so nice.
We're talking with Andy Cilek with the Minnesota Voters Alliance and Sarah Walker with the Second Chance Coalition and Restore the Vote Minnesota about whether or not felons should have their voting rights restored. We've got a ton of phone calls. We'll get to them. But, Sarah, I've got a question for you.
Yes, I'm ready.
You want to restore the civil rights of felons.
Mm-hmm.
All of them?
Well, honestly, I have worked on many issues related to incarcerated populations and people with criminal records, trying to get them more access to jobs and housing and education. And I do think, because we have the system of over-incarceration, that many civil rights, I think all of them should be reconsidered.
Like your Second Amendment rights,
well,
as it were.
I actually think, so one of the interesting things is when you're going I don't know, probably many of us here have been door knocking at some point, and just talking about this issue, yes, many people say that, you know, there is, the first thing they want to know, I mean, other than whether they can vote, is when they can get their gun rights restored. And I think there should be significant things looked at to consider when and how people can get their gun rights back. And I think that groups like the Gun Owner Civil Rights Alliance and the NRA, that should be one of the issues they're looking at. If they want to, you know, I don't work on that issue, and if they wanted to approach someone from our coalition and have that conversation, I would welcome it.
Cool. Wonderful. All right, let's go to the phones. Flamingo Dave in Santiago. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning, and how's everyone doing today?
Great.
Okay, number one, Andy, I do want to say that this station does have more listeners than public radio, but number two, to Sarah, I'd like to know, part of probation is restitution. Are you going to skip over restitution because these people decide, well, I want to vote, and they blow off the restitution once they've got their voting rights back?
Well,
thanks, Dave.
So first of all, I guess I would talk about this as a systemic problem, which is I think that people who are doing well in the community are more likely to be able to pay their restitution. But I also think that, you know, we shouldn't, that brings us back to a time period where it comes down to people with means are going to be more likely to be able to vote because they're more capable of paying off restitution. And so I think as long as someone's making good faith efforts, and if you don't make good faith efforts to paying off your restitution or working towards that, you will end up reincarcerated, at which point you'll lose your right to vote.
Thanks, Dave. Let's go to Shannon in Lake Elmo. Good morning, Shannon.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm an election judge, and when I was going through the training, and actually during the election, I saw, felony challenge. I said, well, what happens when this person comes in to vote? What do you do? And they explained the process to me, and I said, so how do they prove that their civil rights have been restored? I said, well, they don't have to prove it, but they're violating their parole if they vote when they're not supposed to. I said, so we have to take the felon's word for it, that their civil rights are restored? So what if it turns out later they voted and they shouldn't have? How do we uncount that vote? And the answer is we can't.
Thank you, Shannon. Andy, how do you uncount votes? Hit the on button there first, sir.
You have to, I think that's another show, Jack. That's a whole nother show. So, you can't uncount the votes. Once they go in there, they're all confidential, and once they're in the ballot. In Minnesota, they actually check them after the election. So right. That's what probably the next time I'm on, hopefully, if you invite me back, we'll be talking about.
Of course.
But if I may, how much time do we have? Because I'm going to have a couple last-minute points here.
No, we have lots in this segment.
Okay.
Let's take this phone call first before we get to your points. James in Waseca.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, what's going on?
I just wanted to make a point that there's a huge difference between statistics that are being given are done from state statistics. I'm a corrections officer at the FCI Waseca. Federal inmates do not have parole. There is no such thing as a parole system. You say if you get 15 years, you do 15 years to the calendar day, actually. Secondly, I'm in charge of 278 inmates all to myself. A large majority of my inmates are mentally incompetent, in my opinion, to vote. A lot of these people have gang affiliations with the mafia, all the way to cartel, and they're not competent enough to do any kind of voting, in my opinion. That's just what it comes down to. These people are the worst of the worst. that are actually locked up in federal institutions.
And you're not advocating, Sarah, to have people who are in prison get their voting rights
No,
restored.
I'm not. And,
That's next.
And yeah, right. And the other thing is, just for perspective, I actually spent almost my entire life before I entered politics full time working as running community corrections facilities, working with the most serious violent offenders and having to make decisions whether or not to put them back into prison. And so to think that I'm not worried about public safety, but the other thing is we actually took federal inmates who actually were on supervised release, and so I just would say that's inaccurate. And yes, we use state-based, we're talking about state-based statistics here for a reason, because voting rights laws are state-based.
Okay. Thank you,
I think
James.
you're looking at minimum security inmates that are actually in minimum security areas. I'm talking about your average person here in Minnesota, as you're talking about, that is in medium security, because you don't have a low security institution here in Minnesota.
All right, thanks, James. The idea of mentally incompetent people voting, we cannot completely destroy the DFL's voting base.
Right. I mean, Keith
So we need
Ellison
to keep-
continues to
right,
win.
Right.
So
They're people. They have rights. And a whole party dedicated to them.
Yep. And Judge Frank to back them up if you make it through the federal court.
So here's my concern. If you break the law to a point where it's a felony, you've harmed somebody, there should be punishment. And if not getting to vote is part of that punishment, really I'm not losing any sleep. If giving people the right to vote leads to them not heading back to prison somehow, I'm willing to listen. But is there a middle ground? The folks who have really screwed up never get their right to vote back, and people who committed a not that serious felony, if
Yes,
there's
there
such a
is.
thing? Okay.
There is, and actually, this is one of the things many people have said today, and we had this conversation about one of the answers to addressing this is to stop putting a lot of nonviolent offenders on long periods of probation and changing sentencings. But I would say this also. One of the other things we should do is for really serious violent offenders, look at increasing those sentences. Those people, if we think they're so dangerous that they shouldn't vote, they shouldn't be released from prison.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes both ways. We should be focusing our correctional and public safety dollars on keeping those people incarcerated for long periods of time and not focusing on low-level offenders who are nonviolent and living in the community.
again, it goes back to the issue of sentencing reform, which I think is something that is very necessary, and to me more of an issue than restoration of voting rights for those that are on parole. Let's fix who ends up on parole and probation and how long they end up on it, rather than fight this battle. I would fight that battle first. I'm saying.
I will tell you this. I don't think it's an either or, but I also think that I don't think you have to choose one or the other. I think they're both necessary functions, and I would welcome the opportunity to come back here with another bipartisan group and talk about sentencing reform.
Well, good luck finding a Republican. Subtly works on the radio. All right, Andy, you had comments you wanted to make.
Yeah, well, I just want to touch up just one follow-up to the Walter Hudson conversation. When he talks about the Republican Liberty Caucus, what Mr. Hudson failed to inform the audience is he is also on the board, this is all public information, of Minnesota Majority. That group, as you know, Dan McGrath's been on this show, that board certainly did not support this bill. So I think what Walter Hudson should have done was resign for that board before he goes down and testifies for that bill. I just think he's being a little disingenuous.
Over one issue, he can't have a one-issue disagreement with.
No, because that's one of their fundamental core issues, and I think I think
that's between him and the board.
And
that is, but I'm gonna get away from that. I just wanted to get one thing in there.
It's not about
I'm
Walter
calling for his resignation from the board. Okay, let's just call it at that.
It's been called.
It's been called. But here's what this is all about. This is all about. I have an article in last January 2014 from the Washington Examiner, and they have a study from the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. Studies have shown that over 6-to-1 felons in this country register as Democrats. That's what this is about. There's governors all over the country that are fighting to get felons. And some states are even flip-flopping depending on which governor's in there, including Iowa, where they had a 2005 law that restored voting rights after a certain period. And in 2011, they flipped it back. So felons can no longer vote in any time in Iowa. But that's what this is about. This is about following the power. I think that's why these people in these institutions and these county attorneys, a lot of them are elected positions. And that's why I think Mike Freeman, the Hennepin County attorney, is because he's an elected politician. He's a liberal Democrat. And I think that's what this is about. This is about politics. What we're all about is the Constitution. And the Constitution says, unless restored to civil rights, and I believe the people of Minnesota should be able to vote on it. So when I say out of public view, I'm talking about the legislative process that didn't pass through committee. Now they're going to go around with their backroom deals to put it on an omnibus bill. And we're against that. And I still say most people in Minnesota, I've been traveling around the state too this last couple of weeks, most people even haven't heard of this felon stuff. So, and a lot
but most people haven't heard of anything. Carl, let's take Carl on line 2. Good morning, Carl.
Good morning, guys. How are you?
Carl, doing well. Send your mind.
Thanks for having me. I thought, as a conservative, I thought we were supposed to be the rational, reasonable, logical people, but clearly the opposite is true this morning.
Burn.
So that's unusual. But in regards to this issue, I'm really surprised that Andy's conflating about 100 different issues with this one, because this issue is about power. It's about the individual's power to vote. And I'm not exactly sure why Andy and why his groups are so scared of the right to vote. This is a fundamental right for Americans. I mean, if we go back to the 18th century, the founding of our country, it was about taxation without representation is what they were fighting against. And that's exactly what happens today. We have felons going back into our community who made a mistake, who served their time in prison, who are now safe enough to be your neighbors, safe enough to be the person you buy your gas from or have anything in your community. And that, but they can go back to the community, they can be your neighbor, but they can't vote because we're scared of that right. And they don't deserve that right.
Thanks, Carl.
Oh, they can vote. They just have to finish their time. I'm not as scared of the people voting. That's what we're calling for. A constitutional amendment so every person in Minnesota can weigh in. That's the whole purpose.
Did you propose a constitutional amendment so every person can weigh in?
What's that?
You just told me before here you hadn't been to the Capitol in 2 years. Are you proposing a constitutional amendment to weigh in on this issue?
No, I'm not.
Okay, and the other thing I just want to say is, I mean, I don't know where your data is. I actually moved to Minnesota to work on this issue in an academic sense. We had the leading expert on felony voting rights at the University of Minnesota, and the recent Slate article actually demonstrated that it actually said that Caucasian felons tend to vote Republican. And I'll just point out for perspective, a lot of people think this is just an urban issue because they think crime's concentrated there. Minnesota, because of our unusual demographics relative to a state like Florida, it would actually probably skew the other way. 64% of people who are felons on probation and parole live outside of the metro area, and the vast majority are Caucasian. People vote their district. And not to mention, you don't make fundamental liberty decisions based on partisan politics.
Well, I'm talking about the American Academy of Political and Social Science. It's in the Washington Examiner, January 1st, 2014. 5 to 7 to 1 average registered Democrat.
So you think you should choose whether or not people should vote based on whether partisan ID?
Well, I do, but that's just me. Andrew, go ahead.
When somebody is on probation or parole, are there other rights that they are denied besides the right to vote?
Currently, there are numerous restrictions around gun rights. In addition, there's what we call a very long list of collateral consequences. Some of them are not constitutionally imposed, but there's restrictions about certain jobs you can't have. There's a long list, and depending on your status as someone who's on probation, there could be other restrictions. And you also have a list of probation conditions that you have to follow.
All right, that is, unless you've got a point, Andrew. We're running out of time. That's it for today. Shockingly, neither one of you was convinced by the other one's argument, but I'm guessing this issue is not going away for quite some time. Thank you very much, Sarah Walker with Restore the Vote, Andy Cilek with the Minnesota Voters Alliance. Appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
When we return, we'll talk with Ben Johnson with the City Pages about the very serious topic of butt shankings in Mankato.
When Rush Limbaugh speaks, people listen. If we could get everyone to listen, just imagine how nice life would be.
Think about that.
Rush Limbaugh, weekday mornings at 11.
I'm not bragging.
On Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130 and 103.5